Do you know this moth-eaten rook?
Well, in a way...
I've never stopped loving you.
Owl, on the other hand, has probably the most amount of development in one series than any of the other characters have done before or since. She starts off as her typical pompous self, though seems to have gotten a bit thinner skin since the last series, since she was insulted time and time again and didn't bat an eyelid, whereas here, Weasel's comments cause her to become very self-conscious and saddened, hence why she flies off. Maybe Owl needs to become a YouTube partner. We basically go through training to ignore trolls. Hell, a bunch of hecklers could barge down my door right now, hurl insults at me, and I wouldn't even care. Which is basically what happens every time I go on Twitter. Regardless of the arbitrary way she becomes like this, Owl's transformation into a more self-conscious character does actually work for her, even if the embarrassment employed towards her throughout the series is a bit degrading. It does allow her to admit her own faults, even only subconsciously, and break down the walls that she set up for herself over the years and let others in, not even during her major bit of development that happened to her last year. I think one of the main things that helped her do that was when Rooker constantly wouldn't leave her alone, which is arguably close to what can be considered stalking, but even though we are supposed to laugh at him because of it, I feel that we're supposed to sympathise with him too, which I don't know what kind of message that is supposed to send to his stalking attitude, but he is a rather endearing character, and I think it comes across from how his voice is very enjoyable to listen to, very soft and unthreatening, much like the voice of a poet or an artist, or James May.
I'll cut head off. You will need a beep there, BBC Two.
And even though he does get a rather bittersweet ending, it is nice to see him have a proper closure as opposed to the other characters like him who would have just disappeared and never been heard from again. And his kind and dedicated nature towards Owl is genuinely nice to watch, even if you could laugh at the idea of a rook trying to have it away with an owl, which is part of the point of his character, but I can see why some fans wanted to see him and Owl get together, and the final admission of respect from Owl at the end is a nice touch, especially since not everyone likes Rollo. Rollo is arguably a bit like a character from a rom-com or a teenage romance movie who is rather rough around the edges, but has the protagonist thinking, I can change him, which is always an infuriating element to see. The only times I can think where that actually worked was in Beauty and the Beast, which does it a bit differently, and 10 Things That I Hate About You, where the relationship feels way more natural, and his constant narcissism does get annoying, but he does grow on you, even if he is, again, mostly used for comic relief, which is not only stupid, but it's also annoying for me because I keep forgetting how to write the word relief when I'm writing this script. But I can see why Owl got together with him in the end, since he does have some of Owl's pompous and self-righteous qualities, so while not one of my favourite characters, he does make sense to me, and it's nice to see Owl finally have a happy ending, even if we don't get to see where that leads. Seeing Owl and Rollo raise their kids would have been way more interesting than seeing the Weasels raise theirs. Talking of which...
We didn't come all the way back here just to fight your battles for you. Typical behaviour.
I've already talked, or more like ranted, in great detail about the Weasels in the proceedings in the past, so I'm just going to sum up here what I think of the Force so that we can move on and finally leave these Weasels behind once and for all. Weasel is a bitch and is annoying in how she constantly blames others for what goes wrong, which is something that she rarely did in the last series, and I can understand why she does it because she's concerned for her kids, which is sweet, but it just gets annoying to hear her say, "This is all your fault." Measley is pathetic, even more so than he was in the last series, though I give him credit that he at least tries to be useful, even if he fails constantly, which is about the only thing that comes close to being funny in the Weasel subplot, in that he's the only character that goes through any kind of development in the subplot in general, in that he finally stands up to Weasel and tells them to go back to White Deer Park. It comes out of nowhere and it isn't built up very well, but at least it was something. And the kids are nothing but annoying. Hands down the worst characters besides the occasional one-off guest character to be introduced into Farthing Wood. And now we're finally done and we can move on, and if I never see another Weasel in my life, it'll be too fucking soon.
Useless guard dog. Useless sheepdog. If only I could do something where I could use my mind.
Again, I'll be quick here, but what I will say about Rollo is despite his voice seemingly getting even more annoying compared to the last series, he does become more sympathetic in this series compared to the last one. In the last series he was just a titanic fuck up. Here he's completely neurotic and totally pathetic, to the point where you start to feel sorry for him after a while, though his voice still annoys me to no end, and he's still ranked up very high on my hate-o-meter. But he got a happy ending eventually, and he did help out in the final battle in the end against Bully and his rats, so I'm willing to cut him a little bit more slack this time. Though if I ever meet whose idea it was to bring him back for this series, I'm going to line him up with PewDiePie, Movie Bob and the Fine Brothers and give them all a smack squarely on the chops.
Bully loves you all!
Bully, as I've said before, is an interesting move on from Scarface as an actual active villain in the series. While he does have some comedic elements, I can feel that the writing team did want us to feel intimidated by him, and I feel that it does work sometimes. While he's not that intimidating on his own, though he can come off rather cruel and vicious sometimes, the sheer numbers of his rat army do help back him up, even if his voice doesn't exactly strike fear into your hearts like Scarface does. But it would have been interesting to see what would have happened if Bully and Scarface ever teamed up, even if Bully probably would have gotten his head bitten off by Al Pacino, though I think some fans would have liked to have seen that anyway. I can understand why some people don't like Bully. He's a joke compared to how the previous villain was presented to us. His constant nonsensical catchphrase is annoying, and his defeat is completely pathetic to the point where it would make Caligula go, "Seriously, dude?" I do feel he's gotten a bit of a bad rep amongst the fan base. I mean, think about the fact that he's the only character in the whole of Farthing Wood who's motivated by superior genes in the species rather than breed like Scarface was. Eugenics and conquest altogether, meaning he's probably the closest thing we could have to Hitler in Farthing Wood. I like Hitler in real life, and most representations of him in media, he went out like a pussy. But yeah, I can understand why some people don't like him, but he's not that bad of a villain. I've seen way worse, but he's certainly no Rattigan or Jenner.
I may be cured of my bad tempers, but I still don't like weasels.
Trey, on the other hand, despite the fact that his temper does affect the events in the main story, barely does anything than scream and shout. He's all smoke, but no fire, basically. And the way that he's defeated in the end is quite frankly tragic. And his voice, despite Rupert Farley trying to do his best Malcolm McDowell impression, does grate on me after a while. But it is a little funny to see him throw fits at the tiniest of things, and it's pretty accurate. Stags can be very ill-tempered in real life, though I don't understand why they decide to make all the other deer arseholes in this series.
We'll stampede over them and squash the lot.
With the exception of this guy, of course. While Lair doesn't appear much in the series, and disappears like many of the other characters after the final battle, whenever he does appear, it's always awesome. With that great accent and no-nonsense attitude, Laird is a fitting follow-on from the White Stag, even if he does act a tad antagonistic sometimes towards the animals and even his own herd. It's always great to see him on the small occasions he actually is around. And now on to the centerfold of the show, though not literally of course, I've seen enough fan art to last me a lifetime as I've said, is the animation. As always, the animation is going to be both one of the harder and easier things to talk about in this series, but this time that comes down to how much there's changed in the last two series. While we do get some of the gorgeous watercolour backgrounds, which are clearly mostly recycled from the previous series, I do wonder what it would have been like redoing all the background in the style that would have better fitted the new animation, since every character has been remodelled, and the new cartoony animation doesn't fit the background at all. It's like having Disney characters in a down and dirty Ralph Bakshi world. It just doesn't really fit. Though I guess that is what the tattoo princesses are for. On the bright side, it does mean that they rarely reuse the same animation cells and frames, but the frame rate of the animation is extremely inconsistent, to the point where it nearly starts looking like the Magic Voyage, and in some cases it's clear that characters are just moving between very limited pre-drawn positions. So personally I prefer the animation of the last two series, since at least it was consistently decent, even if they did switch between about 3 or 4 different animation teams for the episodes. But the new animation style does at the very least lend to some more cartoony visuals, like, remember this bit? That would have been half the animation budget in Series 1, but they utilise it in a new style of animation to their fullest for the comedy, which is why there were so many new comic relief characters, so I can at least give them that for a positive on the animation, and the models do look very well made, with good colours even if they do stand out a bit too much from the watercolour backgrounds like I said, and just have the right amount of detail, which is the main fault for Series 1's animation. It didn't have much detail at all, and their experimentation did help with future projects, but it does create a really bizarre contrast from the last two series, and like I said, it is terribly up and down throughout the whole show. And lastly, we have themes, which is going to be a bit tricky this series, since I don't really remember that many reoccurring themes this series. But I do remember 1 or 2 little elements when I was watching. This series seems to emphasise the importance of keeping those who are close to you, well, close, really. Fox feels concerned for his family, and Whisper is very clingy to Plucky after what happened to Bold at the end of the last series. Bully considers all of his rats as his family, and while he does consider them expendable, everything he does is for their benefit. Even the weasels do what they do for the benefit of their children. And on the less nepotistic side of things, Mossy is very attached to Hercule as a way of softening the pain of losing Badger. Rollo hangs on to the weasels since they're the only ones who have ever respected him properly. Plucky and Dash have an almost extremely close friendship, to the point when they're apart, Dash becomes very depressed and desperately tries to find someone to race her and try and get the rush she got when racing Plucky, but it was Plucky that she truly needed. Please, for all the things that are saying, do not read into that line too much. And she got what she needed when Plucky came back. Or that line either. And of course the friendship that Toad and Spike have is so great that it causes Spike to defect from the rats entirely, and this is one of the few ways that the oath is kept up in a more plausible way than just verbally acknowledging its existence, by having the animals band together and be with one another in a crisis, and leaving their predetermined roles of predator and prey behind to be friends and help the future of their civilization. Man, after not having a joke about Zootopia for so long, now it won't leave me alone. That's basically the premise for the movie in a nutshell. In all seriousness, this is very well done in this series, and it does resemble Zootopia a bit, the major example being that Dash and Plucky are the best friends despite being, you know, Hare and Fox. Again, not unlike Zootopia. If Rupert Farley and Stacey Jefferson don't make cameos as Nick Wilde's parents, then there is going to be some serious problems for Disney. Not just from me, but from the Farthing Wood fanbase in general. The only other two major themes I noticed was looking for what your heart's desire is. This is of course mostly explored in Owl's story, but there's a little bit in what Bully's doing for the rats, and Weasel and Measley are doing it for their kids, and the other major theme is reflection and looking back on the past. After all, some of these characters are really old by this point, so naturally they would start to reminisce, especially Owl, who does it in a much bigger sense, but also because of this being the last series and giving that swan song feeling, and making it feel like a more grandiose when Fox steps down from his mantle, giving the leadership role to Plucky, and saying how the legend of Farthingwood will live on with him and his family forever, as it will with us as well. Overall, it is definitely the worst series, but it is still Farthingwood overall, and if you filter out all those annoying parts, it is still a good story in general. It's just a shame that in trying to switch things up for this series, it all went a bit pear-shaped. So what happened to Farthingwood after this? Well, at Series 4, and as mentioned before, a Weasel spin-off show was suggested and even partially penned, but nothing came of either of them. But most of the same cast and crew returned to make Noah's Island, which allowed them to have more creative freedom because it was their own creation, for better or worse. I might take a quick look at that in the future. Colin Down went on to make one more Farthingwood book called The Beginning, which details the lives of the generation that existed before the gang we would come to know, and give greater insight into Farthingwood, Fox and Badger's dads, and the other animals that didn't go to White Deer Park. And while it has very little to do with the main story, besides the acknowledgement of the construction work starting near the end of the book, it is enjoyable and a return to the harsh, dark world presented in the first few books. Though it would have been a little bit interesting to see how it would have been if they adapted it, but sadly that never happened. Very little information exists about the original production team, animation studios, or even the producer, but as for the cast, we do know a few things. After Noah's Island, Rupert Farley went on to be a bit part actor for a few movies, but most interestingly became a voice actor in many video games, most notably as one of the many voices of Fable 3. Stacey Gregg didn't do much else besides Farthingwood, though she did have a lot of success in dubbing anime such as Project A-ko and X before eventually retiring. Sally Grace worked alongside the BBC by doing some of the voices for Farthingwood's other sister show besides Noah's Island, Dennis the Menace, as Granny, and later made a brief return to Coronation Street where she starred as Sean Tully's stepmother, Maggie, and also provided the voice of Mr. Bean's girlfriend, Irma. No, not those ones, but close. In the animated series of Mr. Bean, and also played Daisy's mum in Spaced. Jeremy Barrett also did little after Farthingwood besides a bit part in The Bill, and Pamela Crevical only did this and Tickets for the Titanic in 1988. John Glover, on the other hand, managed to put his awesome voice to great use as King George V in Downton Abbey, several other characters in Doctors and Casualty, and the Claw Shan Sheath in the Sarah Jane Adventures, and joined Rupert in being in many video games, including Fable 3 as well, and Sally Grace in Mr. Bean. He got around in his career. And finally, the man himself, Ron Moody, went back to acting in many British shows such as The Bill, Holby City, Casualty and EastEnders before his tragic death in 2015. None of this is confirmed as fact, by the way. Except Ron Moody's death, that is tragically very true, but most of this is extrapolated from their IMDb pages, and very little of this information is supported by other websites, and most of these guys haven't actually been seen since they did Farthingwood and Noah's Island. Which is really sad, really. These guys were really good voice actors, and I would have loved to have seen them do other things besides this. but that's life, I suppose. But for one last time, remember the oath, remember Farthing Wood, and I've had enough of this. I'm going on the other side to have a bath. Bye!